All right, good afternoon, everybody. I am Roel Decker's chair of the NUF chapter here in Boston, Massachusetts. For those of you unfamiliar with the NUF, we are the Netherlands-America Foundation, founded over a century ago by former President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Thomas Watson, perhaps better known as the founder of IBM. Our mission is to continue to strengthen the bonds between our nations and our community through the exchange in the arts, sciences, education, business, and public affairs, including sponsorship of NUF Fulbright fellowships and other programs in these areas. Thank you for joining us today at our inaugural webinar, the first in a series highlighting the Dutch Masters. Our webinar series are a celebration of art featured at the Center of Netherlandish Art, an innovative research center at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Boston. Please join us in welcoming today Jennifer Deckers, also of the NUF Boston, Maggie Maloney of the Central NUF Organization, and our special guest art historian, Dr. Amy Golahny. Today's presentation will feature Rembrandt, one that's near and dear to our hearts, having grown up in Leiden myself, along with a number of our fellow board members. So with that said, I will ask Jennifer to take it from here and get us started.
Thank you, Roel, and welcome everyone. We are so thrilled to have you join us here this evening. Before we start, I just wanted to list a couple of different household items. So Dr. Golahny's presentation will take us to approximately 6 p.m. this evening, after which you're welcome to stay for a Q&A session. We just ask that you pose any questions that you might have in the Q&A feature, which you can find at the bottom of your screen, and then we will be able to pose them to Dr. Golahny. Dr. Golahny earned her PhD from Columbia University and a master's degree from Clark Art Institute at Williams College. Amy, professor of art history emerita at Lycoming College in Williamsburg, Pennsylvania, has served as president of the Historians of Netherlandish Art and the American Association for Netherlandic Studies. Her books include Rembrandt's Reading, Rembrandt Studies in His Varied Approaches to Italian Art, and most recently, a monograph on Rembrandt's 100 Guilder print. Her articles on Peter Losman, Rembrandt, Jan Steen, Italian neoclassical sculpture, and other topics have appeared in the Journal of Historians of Netherlandish Art, Master Drawings, the Art Bulletin, Nederlands Kunsthistorisch Jaarboek, Oud-Holland, 19th Century, and other foremost journals. Her research has been supported by the National Endowment for Humanities, Center for Advanced Studies in Visual Arts, DAD, and other agencies. She is currently an adjunct professor at Rhode Island College and gives presentations on European and American art to community, civic group, colleges, and adult audiences. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Amy Golahny.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Roel. Thank you, Maggie, for doing the technical issues here. Now I am going to share my screen and show some pictures. We're going to look at Rembrandt's master etching, his master print. And it is a print that is often immediately recognized, and its cost has obscured its subject. So we can look at it on various levels. And in this case, you are getting a view of the new galleries at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, Center for Netherlandish Art. In the major case, in the major first gallery, there are 3 relevant prints. The first on the left is the 100 Guilder print. The Boston Museum has a fabulously good impression of it. The middle one is a weak impression taken from the plate after a good impression has been inked. And the third is the cut up plate printed around 1780 by a British amateur who thought he was doing Rembrandt a favor. What he did in effect was buy the plate, print some copies, chop it up, print some more copies, and get rid of the plate. So that, in a way, is the fate of this print. I am not going to go into technical material except to introduce a couple of small components that go into an etching. First, there's a copper plate. The copper plate gets treated with wax, scratched through, bitten with acid, cleaned up, inked, cleaned up again, and run through a press. And so the process is rather complicated, but it means that it results in a multiple image that can be reproduced up to, let's say, 50 times if it's a good plate. There are certain terms here, and one is impression. An impression is each individual print from the plate. The state is whenever the artist makes a change, it becomes a different state. And the support in Rembrandt's prints is important because he's very experimental. He's experimental in his paintings. He's experimental in his prints. And sometimes he's going to print on European paper. And then somewhere around the time that he makes the 100 guilder print, he discovers Asian paper. And he gets very different effects from these two different kinds of paper. This self-portrait is in fact printed on European paper, which gives a rather crisp appearance to the lines. A print on Asian paper like this one is going to have a more atmospheric tone throughout. And it's this print that is perhaps the kind of print that makes us wonder a lot about Rembrandt's technique and where the print was, in whose hands it came shortly after or during Rembrandt's lifetime. So this is a print at the Rijksmuseum. It's a very early impression on Japan paper, and it has inscriptions on the back that have caused much discussion. We will look at the back of the print. Now, there are two states in this print, the 100 guilder print, and there's very little difference between the two of them. The first is going to be printed by Rembrandt under his close supervision. The second state will be also printed by Rembrandt, but then it will fall into other hands. The action has caused a great deal of consternation. There are a lot of figures here, and we don't always know quite who they are, what they're doing, or why they're there, but we have a lot of good theories. Christ stands at the center amidst a crowd of faithful. Many of them are in various conditions of illness. A woman is bringing a child to Christ for his blessing. There's a group of Jewish elders here at the ledge, and they are arguing. They're going to debate with Christ about the laws of marriage, because this is one of those components in the Gospels where Christ proclaims that divorce is not permissible under any circumstances, but Jewish law permits divorce for some reasons. Matthew 19 is the main source for Rembrandt's print, but other passages concerning healing apply. Specifically, the rich man who is here is wearing some very richly brocaded clothing. There's a camel in the doorway. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to gain entrance to heaven. That is one of the parables that Christ speaks several times in the Gospels, but it's also included in Matthew 19. So we have all these different actions put together in one frame. The Jewish elders, the Pharisees, the mothers and children, there are several of them, the Apostle Peter, who objects, the camel, the donkey, the African, and the tenders to the camel and the donkey. The technique enhances the value of this print because in the shadows, Rembrandt has inked it very richly and very carefully wiped these cross-hatched shaded areas. So there's a nuance of depth to these shadows. And the same is true elsewhere in the shadows. But then, although these figures on the right are done in very fine lines, the figures on the left are done rather sketchily. So there's a distinction in how the figures are rendered. Now we get to the back of this particular print. There are two inscriptions, and they've been well discussed in the literature and caused a great deal of discussion. In this case, we are looking at inscriptions that are not done during Rembrandt's lifetime, but sometime much later, mid-18th century. And this inscription in French records a lost inscription in black chalk that has presumably been smudged off. It is written in black chalk, "Gift in honor of my special friend, Rembrandt, in exchange for the plague by Mark Antony." And that documents a gift, an exchange of this sheet, this impression of the 100 guilder print, for an engraving after Raphael that we know a lot about. So Rembrandt is making an exchange. He's making an exchange between his own production and a print after Raphael, this one, not necessarily this particular impression, but it's this print, the plague, or nicknamed in Italian, Il Morvetto. It's one of the most famous Renaissance prints, and it was well known because it has a Virgil source, and it's written about by Raphael's biographer. In the Aeneid, Aeneas leaves the ruined Troy. He lands on Crete where there is a plague raging. The gods appear to him in a dream telling him to move on. This is not where you should stay. And he's supposed to get to Italy to fulfill his destiny. In the dream, the sacred images of the gods, whom I had borne with me from Troy out of the burning city, stood before me as I lay in slumber. That's what Aeneas says. And these images of the gods are telling him to move on. The inscription here is about the plague. Men gave up their sweet lives or dragged enfeebled frames. So this is really an image about illness, death, and horror. So we're looking at two prints, Christ healing, a positive, and the plague on Crete, which is a devastation, a negative. The 100 guilder print is healing in Christian terms. The plague on Crete is a pagan culture beset by disease. And the question is, why would Rembrandt exchange this print? It's late, it's towards the end of his life, and he already knew the print. He already had owned it. Possibly he sold it, but he's very keen to exchange his own production for it. Maybe he had a few impressions of the 100 guilder print lying around, and he was willing to trade one for the plague. He wants to equate them in value. And prints are usually a guilder or sometimes less. They are never 100 guilders. There are a few exceptions, and those are prints by Lucas van Leyden. But documented Raphael prints go for quite a high sum. Nicholas Berchem in 1660 paid 60 guilders for a rare engraving after Raphael. Not this one, but one just as highly prized. If the 100 guilder print had actually sold for 100 guilders, Rembrandt could claim that his etching was worth more than one of the most exalted Raphael prints. In 1654, the Antwerp art dealer Meysens writes to a client that yes, Rembrandt's print has sold for 100 guilders, but it should be only around 30, and he will actually sell it for 30. But for Rembrandt, the Raphael Il Morbetto had a pagan parallel in visual terms to Christ's healing, blessing, and salvation. Virgil's Aeneas emerges from Troy and is guided by his own divine vision. Christ sees the suffering of humanity, miraculously heals it, and is also guided by his divine vision. At the same time, we're looking at Christianity displacing paganism, and we were also looking at figures ill, lying, or dying that have resonance in Rembrandt's print. However, side by side, centimeter by centimeter, this is not an even exchange. Prints were very often priced by size. So the 100 guilder print should have been worth more than this particular Raphael print. Rembrandt is making the equation of both value, artistic worth, and monetary worth by doing this. He's establishing a baseline for his print. Now, on the back of the print, there's a much longer inscription that gives us more context for who one of the earliest owners could have been. This is an 18th century handwriting that presumably records either an earlier passage on another sheet of paper or some kind of oral history that is passed down through successive owners of the print. Rembrandt, in love with a print by Marcantonio, known as The Plague, of which his friend Jan Peter Zomer had a very beautiful impression and could not be convinced to sell it to him, made a present to have it of this print, rarer and more curious than the print one calls the 100 guilder print, by the additions in the chiaroscuro. According to a report made to me, there were not but a very few impressions made, of which not one was ever sold in Rembrandt's time, but distributed among his friends. Now, who wrote this inscription is a mystery, but it mentions Jan Peters Zomer, and it implies that he, an art dealer, was an original owner of the print, if not the original owner. So this inscription tells us a lot. Zomer's impression of the Raphael was very beautiful, but he would not sell it to Rembrandt. Zomer wanted the 100 guilder print. He understood that the one he wanted was fine and with deep shadows. He understood that there were few impressions made and it had limited distribution. The me who wrote this inscription isn't known, but it would seem to be recording some earlier lore. So we have this 100 guilder print as an item of worth. Jan Six, Rembrandt's friend and patron, was gifted one impression by Rembrandt, and that impression is in fact in the St. Louis Museum of Art. Hendrik Waterloos, a poet, was gifted an impression, and presumably it's the impression on which he wrote for verses, presumably for publication. And then we have the exchange for the Raphael. These are three impressions. One is a gift for sure. One is a gift and a support for a poem. and a third is an exchange. The prices recorded during Rembrandt's lifetime are very few, but one is 100, should be 30. After Rembrandt's lifetime, a young man, Johann Friedrich von Offenbach, in 1711, picked one up for 1 guilder, and the rumor that it sold for 100 guilders. But it's more than a rumor. Recently, a document has been brought to light by Michiel Roskam Abbey, and that document is the first recorded statement about the print at all. It is recorded in the diary of Ernst Brink before 1649. One print, "Let the children come to me," Rembrandt the painter sold for 100 guilders due to its excellence. And this means that before 1649, certainly by early 1649 or 1648, the print was in circulation. And Brink's line gives us a lot of detail. He understands what the subject is, Christ blessing the children. He knows that Rembrandt himself sold the print for this price. In other words, it did not go through a dealer. And finally, it was considered excellent. So the main action, according to Brink, is Christ blessing the children. But there are so many other figures crowding around that it has kind of confused the action. So to figure this out, we go to the Northern tradition of illustrated Bibles. Rembrandt is very much into that tradition, but he doesn't use it without a great deal of editorial hand. Now, he's also including this parable, the camel and the rich man. This is a parable that is very difficult to illustrate. It's kind of nonsensical. The needle descends from the cloud, the camel is about to go through the eye, and the rich man with his purse has trouble getting through the gate of heaven. Well, it's an allegory. It's not meant to be a realistic representation, but Rembrandt is going to split up the rich man and the camel so it looks casually credible and natural. So here's the camel and his driver, the African man, the donkey and his driver, and this long line of all these people waiting and crowding in from the archway for healing. Peter objects. The rich man puts his hand over his mouth because he doesn't want to give up his riches. And these are the Pharisees. The viewer has to bring the text to the print. Rembrandt's familiar with other cases where there are multiple scenes in a print. In Lucas van Leiden, the conversion of St. Paul takes place here, and then Paul, blinded, is led away to Damascus. This is a way of putting two events in one frame, but the same person appears twice. Rembrandt won't do that. It is, however, in the tradition of Bibles that he knew. So here, this is an illustrated Bible with an abbreviated text where the different episodes are keyed to this abbreviated text. So one reads the events. Christ does this, Christ does that. Everybody appears around Christ, but Christ himself is going to appear multiple times. And one would read this as if one were reading the text of the Bible through pictures. These Bibles proliferated in Leiden and Amsterdam, and Rembrandt certainly knew them. So this is Christ healing a man, this is Christ multiplying the loaves and doing other miracles, and the adulterous woman. And so all of this would be understood as taking place in a sequence. But Rembrandt is going to give us a lot of episodes in a sequence without repeating the same figure. So much is going on here. The healing, the blessing, the debating, the camel, that it was easier to call this print by its price tag, which was unique, rather than any of the single actions going on in it. I think this is a good time for a break. What do you think, Jennifer? Are we ready for a break?
Sure. So I just wanted to ask anyone, if anyone has any questions about what's been presented so far, please feel free to pose those in the Q&A feature, or you could use the chat also. It's a relatively small group. And if not, then I would also encourage you that should any questions pop up, please feel free to pose those in the chat, and I'll be able to pose them at the next break.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In Rembrandt's studio, the print was known. Its effect was immediate. All of Rembrandt's pupils after 1649 are going to make some kind of reference to the 100 guilder print. Nicholas Maas is a pupil in Rembrandt's studio around 1648. He hangs around for a few years, but by 1653, he's back in his native city of Dordrecht. He makes this grand picture, which is very large, possibly while he is still in Rembrandt's Amsterdam studio. It completely reinterprets the 100 guilder print. So yes, we see Christ blessing. Well, that clarifies the action. And perhaps Nicholas Maas wanted to clarify the action. Perhaps he looked at the 100 guilder print and thought, there's too much going on there. But he struggled for that. He didn't just come at this solution, Christ's hand on the head of one child, while the mother pushes the child gently in his direction. Another child is held here by the mother, and a third child is held up by a father. So there are only a few children, but they are the focus of the whole scene in terms of emphasis. But Maas had to figure out what he was doing. He starts out with a couple of drawings where Christ stands, as Christ does in Rembrandt's print, and puts his hand on a baby held by the mother. Other children are around, and this wagon recalls the wagon in Rembrandt's print. But then there's this crowd of other people. So Maas has to rethink this. And when he rethinks it, he thinks, this is too crowded. How can I simplify it? His result is to have a seated Christ with a few foreground children. One stands. And that's his ultimate result. Christ sits with his hand on one child, and another child is there. So the children are really the focus. And it means that when he resolves his design, he's going to give full attention to this central child. He's going to minimize the clutter of all the other figures. So going from the standing Christ to the seated Christ, Maas is really rethinking what his mentor had done. He's going away from Rembrandt towards another solution. This young man is an onlooker, but he's probably a portrait, possibly a portrait of another pupil in Rembrandt's shop at this time, Samuel van Hoogstraten. This man seems to be a pious follower in the back, perhaps an apostle. But what happens really is the highlight of the center. Another Rembrandt pupil, Artegelder, who is in the workshop a little bit later, is thinking the same thing. Rembrandt's print is too cluttered. Now, Artegelder's painting comes down to us with some damage. It seems to be cut down on most sides, at least on the bottom and the two sides, possibly also the top. So we don't really know what it could have been, but we do know that the center, a little girl walking away, a man here, and Christ with his arms open and speaking, would seem to be preaching and possibly talking to this man with this elaborate turban with pearls. So it looks as if he's talking to this man. Perhaps this is the rich man, and Christ is saying that it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for the rich man, this man in the turban, to go to heaven. So we're not sure, but it's this girl walking away. She has received Christ's blessing, and it's the moment after the blessing of the children. Artegelder, however, is not adapting Rembrandt's Christ for his features. He seems to be using a portrait, a young man with thick, full lips, a triangular face and high cheekbones, and intense eyes. He's using the basic parameters of Rembrandt's Christ, but not the individual features. He's doing perhaps what he had learned in Rembrandt's workshop: make a portrait of somebody who could be a stand-in for Christ himself. At the same time, Artegelder had friends in Dordrecht who collected prints, and this is the portrait of one of them. He is holding the 100 guilder print. It has been folded, and his thumb is on part of it. He's holding the print as we never would. He's very well dressed. He's got a sheaf of prints under his arm. And so he's quite comfortable, but very self-confident. He owns this very expensive piece of paper, and he's showing it off. So it's recognizable that it's the 100 guilder print, but he's holding it as we never would. Now I think here is the time for a quick break. If you are ready. And so my question is questions.
Yeah. So we haven't received, I have received a couple of questions, Amy. I'm just wondering if they might be best towards the end, because they're a bit more generic and not specific to some of the pieces that you have shown, unless you'd like me to pose one or two.
Maybe one question now and save the rest till later.
Sure. So one of the questions that was posed is someone just expressed some curiosity about how much region played a role in inspiring Rembrandt's work.
How much reading?
No, region, I think geographical location.
Okay.
Yeah.
Region, that is how Dutch is Rembrandt.
Yeah, there you go.
Well, he's very Dutch. But what Dutch meant in 1600 to 1645, when he's basically going through his artistic formation, is very different from what Dutch might mean today. The regional prints that he is most interested in are local, Leiden printmakers, Lucas van Leiden first and foremost. Those illustrated Bible prints that I showed are produced in Leiden. And they are distinctly Northern. They're by Northern artists from Holland, effectively, or the newly formed Dutch Republic. And they are regional. They're very distinctly regional. German prints play a big role, but one could argue that Germany is regional. Certainly printmaking is international. So if something appears in print, it travels. It can be sold. It is easy to make it go from, let's say, Cologne to Amsterdam and vice versa. And so these international borders are very porous then, as they may be also today.
Terrific. There's actually a follow-up question, Amy, that ties into this a little bit, that came from two different folks here. Just a curiosity about if prints were considered, you might have answered this a little bit, but were prints considered as important as an art form as compared to paintings? You mentioned the transportability, right, of prints.
Prints are generally a lot cheaper. The 100 guilder print is an exception. The prints of Lucas van Leiden are an exception. The prints after Raphael are an exception at this time. Most prints are 1 guilder or 10 for a guilder. Most prints, but there are exceptions when the artistic quality is recognized, when the maker of a print is recognized, and when there's a mystique about a print. And there is a mystique about the 100 guilder print because, oh my goodness, it sold for X. And that creates buzz.
Yeah. Wonderful, thank you. I have some more questions to pose at the end, but I think this will suffice for now. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm going to continue because we're getting into the modern era. The 19th century, the 20th century, and the 21st century. So the 19th century, or let's say the end of the 17th century into the 19th century, all copying, reproduction of an image at this time is going to be mechanical. So the 100 guilder print was famous by the time Brink writes his note, certainly before December 1649. Everybody has buzz about this print. In order to reproduce the 100 guilder print, it has to be a mechanical printmaking technique. So the earliest one is an etching that appears in an abbreviated Bible, and this is it. This is kind of like a survey of art history for 1679 with religious imagery. Melchior Kuzel was a very well-known publisher with a grand ambition to effectively paper Europe with his publications. And in the Bible, he gets etched versions of other artists' work for appropriate passages. And this means that he's going to use Christ curing various illnesses from Luke and Matthew. And it doesn't say the 100 guilder print. It's Christ healing. It's not Christ blessing the children, but that's how he interprets it because he needs an illustration for that passage. So once Melchior Kuzel puts this into his Bible, it's in circulation in other forms. In the 18th century, it's going to be copied as an independent print. Now, most of you might not make the error of assuming this is by Rembrandt himself. It's by Thomas Worledge, but it is etched after a Rembrandt original 100 guilder print because these copies would effectively be reproductions. if people couldn't own the original, they could pick up the copy by Woolridge. And Woolridge really smooths out Rembrandt's rough edges. He deepens shadows, and he gets a lot of texture that approaches mezzotint. The 19th century saw a crazy proliferation for Rembrandt, especially in France and Northern Europe. Léopold Flameng comes out literally as an artist with Christ healing the sick, which in various ways refers exactly to Rembrandt's 100 Guilder print, but he includes northern buildings, and he gets rid of the Pharisees, and there are children there, but it's not clear if Christ is going to bless them. So it becomes this vast parade of Christ healing the sick. But Flameng goes on to make copies after Rembrandt, and in this case, he makes a very elaborate, very full of shadows copy of the 100 Guilder print. He keeps Rembrandt's sketchiness in parts, but he's deepening the shadows because that was kind of fashionable in France around 1870. And Flameng teams up with the Rembrandt scholar Charles Blanc. Blanc is going to publish several books on Rembrandt, kind of flooding the market. But he's going to use illustrations by Flameng. And this is a proof impression, that is a print that includes 9 scenes that are going to be cut up to be inserted into Blanc's publication. These are carefully chosen to reflect Rembrandt's life. The Westerkerk over here, where Rembrandt will be buried. Rembrandt's house, while he still owns it and while he is still successful, with all kinds of people milling about, beggars, merchants, hangers-on. So what Blanc and Flameng team up to do is give a kind of visual corollary to a text of Rembrandt's life. And in Blanc's book, these prints will be tipped in like that. In Paris, there was a kind of obsession with Rembrandt. So it permeates even to expat American artists who are living there. Henry Osawa Tanner is an American artist who moves to Paris. And there he assimilates Rembrandt's prints into his own language. So in this case, he was familiar with the 100 Guilder print, but here he's referring to the raising of Lazarus. His painting is large. It was exhibited at one of the salons and it won a prize. And it's a scene that takes place in a cave with Christ sort of willing Lazarus to rise out of the tomb. But Tanner's Christ figures also show that he has studied Rembrandt for authenticity in the type of Christ that he believes is appropriate. He also goes to Jerusalem and sketches the locals during his travels to get a note of authenticity into his other pictures. When he paints the Supper at Emmaus a few years later, he is looking at the Rembrandt painting at the Louvre, reworking its subject, and still thinking of Rembrandt light. But he's also thinking of the kind of divine power that he reads into Rembrandt's paintings. And that's what he's trying to get in his own work. At the same time, we have other forms of homage, variation, and downright idolatry. Ludwig Michalik was a printmaker in Vienna, and he was teaching printmaking at a girls' school. So he does this demonstration of printmaking techniques. He's going to use Rembrandt for the three crosses over here, and also for the 100 guilder print over here. He uses Dürer to show the beginning of what he would consider great printmaking with Dürer's Melancholia. And in the margins, there are other demonstrations of printmaking techniques. At the same time, he's pairing Dürer and Rembrandt as the two greatest printmakers of Europe. And he's thinking also of their self-portraits. And in this case, he's using the Kenwood self-portrait with two circles, which is a puzzle even today about what these circles mean. It's a debate. But he did himself make a copy of this Kenwood self-portrait. So Michalik, Rembrandt represented a great self-portraitist, the 100 guilder printmaker, the three crosses maker. And this is a way of saying, I think very subtly, that Michalik identified more with Rembrandt than with Dürer, because he gives us two Rembrandt impressions, and he gives Dürer only one. Now, poetic attention is also given to this print from the very time it has been made. Rembrandt gave one impression to a friend of his to make a poem underneath it. Other poems on the 100 guilder print proliferate. Some of them are good, some of them are less good. Dutch poetry is rife with poems on Rembrandt. But the most recent poetic attention to the poem dates from about a year ago, when the American literary scholar Richard Copley wrote this short piece, and he is going to read it. It was a present for me for Mother's Day, because I think I was writing the book about the 100 guilder print, and my husband was tired of hearing about it. So he fought back. He made his own poem to compete with other poems, and also to compete, I think, with Rembrandt.
Thank you, Amy. On Rembrandt's 100 guilder print, for Amy with love. From the left and the right, they are pressing to the figure from whom they seek blessing. The tableau shows his sweet acquiescing, all the detail meet coalescing. And we viewers cannot stop assessing the impression that keeps on impressing.
Thank you. So that's the latest poetic honor that this print has gathered. And it is a way of saying, yeah, we can look at this. We can still look at it. We can find a language in words to express the image. Now, I'm going to end with perhaps less clear examples of homage. The American printmaker Malcolm Myers made this very large intaglio print with homage to Rembrandt. He called it the 100 guilder print. But we see traces of perhaps the three crosses more obviously. But for Malcolm Myers, that didn't matter. He wanted to give it that title because it was a kind of rivalry with one of the foremost printmakers, because he admired Rembrandt's prints, and because it was a way of getting a tag on his print that related immediately to Rembrandt. And the technique is very complicated, which is another way of the artist giving homage to Rembrandt. It's layered of inks and colored inks. And I know it's hard to see in digital flatness, but it's a very complicated print in its printing. Another form of reception and challenge is made by the Austrian performance artist Hermann Nitsch. Nitsch made his own copy in etching of the 100 guilder print. And then, as he does with many of his other images and other objects, he splashed paint on it. Now, this is an impression in the St. Louis Museum of Art, where he does the print first, and then he defaces it with black paint as a kind of challenge to Rembrandt. It's a way of saying, you know, he can take the art of the past off its exalted pedestal, appropriate it, and deface it. I'm going to end with a peculiar comparison. The Catholic Rubens, Saint Ignatius curing and performing miracles, the Protestant Rembrandt, Christ healing the sick, but he's really not healing them. He's blessing the children, and the sick await patiently. So here is the actual miracle happening. Here it has yet to happen. Saint Ignatius has that power. All of this healing is going on. The devil is expelled. It's very dramatic and very noisy. There's a lot of action. Rembrandt is calm. There are no demons to flee. The blessing is happening, almost. The healing has not yet begun. Thank you. And this is the image I will leave you with.
Wonderful, Amy. Thank you so very much. We do have some questions that popped up. If it's okay for me to pose those to you at this time. So one of the questions is, are there other examples of encyclopedic prints that collect a multitude of narrative and pictorial ideas as of creating a school for Bible illustrators and their readers?
Sort of. The Cusel Bible is among the very first compilations of such a kind of survey of art in one volume. In other words, you could walk around with this. It's not a big book, and you would have effectively a survey of European art on subjects that fit the Old and New Testament. There are other compilations like that. That is effectively the first. There are many loose prints that serve the same purpose, but they kind of proliferate in the 19th century. So yes, there are a lot because it's a marketable commodity, and it's desirable to have a lot of images within 2 covers of a book. There are, in the 16th century, that is the Renaissance, in its way starts this tradition of having a book that illustrates the Bible. But very often those prints will be originally put together by a publisher by one artist. They won't be kind of a survey of different artists.
Wonderful, thank you. I have another question here from the chat. Did Rembrandt produce prints throughout his career or during a certain period of time?
He starts out as a painter, but a few years of being a painter in Leiden sees him beginning to experiment with printmaking. And one of the reasons he's going to experiment with printmaking is that he has a friend, Jan Levens, and the two of them seem to be experimenting together. Rembrandt makes a lot of mistakes at first. Etching is a complicated process, and at that time, let's say the recipes for making an etching with an acid bath were not very precise. And so he gets a lot of mistakes. But he begins to get better after a few years. And then he and Jan Levens continue to make prints. And in fact, Rembrandt will copy some of Jan Levens's prints early on as if he's trying to learn the technique, which Levens learned better first. And then Levens goes on to do some prints and even some woodcuts. But Rembrandt goes on to do these very elaborate etchings. And he does continue to do etching until a certain point in his life. The last few years of his life, he's doing no etching, with one or two exceptions. So it's hard to know if he stops doing etching towards the end of his life because he no longer has a studio with the materials, or if he stops doing etching because it's a very visually intense means, and usually eyesight has to be really good to do etching, and corrective lenses in Rembrandt's day were not as precise as they are today.
Thank you so very much. We have a couple more questions here. What did Rembrandt consider the quote unquote target market for his prints? Was it art collectors who would appreciate the quality of his art, or rich merchants who would consider ownership as a symbol of status without really appreciating the art?
All of the above. But when he starts out, when he moves to Amsterdam around 1631-32, basically he's been to Amsterdam, he relocates there because I think he realizes that the opportunities are much greater in Amsterdam than they are in Leiden for an artist. He relocates to Amsterdam and almost immediately is involved with printmaking and publishing. So he also has a few prints published by a professional publisher. And he does make prints for private patrons. A patron, for example, might say, okay, I want X impressions of that print, and I also want the plate, so you can't make any more impressions. I want to have control of the plate because I'm going to buy it from you. So that is one possibility. And we know of a case where one particular merchant buys the plate, but accuses Rembrandt of having made impressions on it before he gets it. So we know that there were some peculiar business dealings going on. When Rembrandt makes a portrait of somebody, let's say Jan Six in 1648, Jan Six owns the plate. And that is a case where the copper plate is still in the Jan Six collection in Amsterdam. The person portrayed in a portrait keeps the plate, typically. Now, that's not always the case, but typically that would be the possibility. Rembrandt, we think, was fairly secretive about his etching process. And only one of his pupils really makes a huge amount of etching work. Most of them do not. It's as if he kind of carefully guarded his secrets. And sometimes we think at a certain point he goes bankrupt. He probably sells 70 copper plates to a particular publisher, and that publisher may reprint them later, but there's some connection with Rembrandt at that point for this publisher. And those plates were largely kept together until a couple of decades ago.
Thank you. Switching back to a more specific question about the 100 guilder print, we see many different ethnicities in the 100 guilder print. Was this inspired by the Bible, or was it Leiden and Amsterdam being more of a multicultural hub at the time?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it's hard to know to what extent Rembrandt is sensitive to that multicultural world of Amsterdam, and to what extent there might be a theological basis for putting an African in the archway, for example. It's also well known that his neighborhood was not so diverse in the early part of the 17th century, but after he moves in, it's going to become more diverse. It's a neighborhood that has artists around 1610, and then the artists kind of stick around, but they sort of move a little bit more towards the center. And then there is a community of Africans living somewhat nearby. I mean, nearby is all relative. Amsterdam is not a big city, but let's say within a 15-minute walk, there was a community of Africans. Then when the Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews begin to move in, they move in to the neighborhood more or less where Rembrandt is living, or a few blocks away, 10 minutes away. So it becomes, in that sense, more international. At the same time, there have always been, as far as we can tell, travelers in Amsterdam from all over, the East in particular, Asia and Africa. In this case, the African here is fairly prominent against the camel, but it's hard to know why beyond a kind of extension of the Christian world to Africa. That is, we don't have a better, more specific explanation, but if you have one, I would love to hear it.
I'll pose that to our audience and see if anyone does. We did have one more question, Amy. What motivated you to focus your scholarship on print versus painting?
I also do paintings.
Okay.
So
I
don't want to slight the paintings. I really don't want to slight the paintings at all. But this is a print that I thought we knew everything about. I mean, I thought, why? We know this print. And I thought there's nothing new to say about it. There's been a huge amount of excellent analysis of it by scholars for, I don't know, well over 100 years. So I thought, well, we know everything about it. But then I began to look into it and realized that there was still something else to say. And there is indeed more to say, but people would look at this print and just be in awe, because it inspires some kind of admiration for technique, yes, but for character, for presence, and for the kind of interest that Rembrandt has in light, dark, and combining that with character. So it's just an amazing print. And yeah, I thought we knew everything there was to know about it. But a few years ago, I began to look at how artists approached it, and that led to the book.
Excellent, thank you. I just want to pose one more time to the audience to see if anybody might have any questions in closing. In the meantime, I just want to send out a hearty thank you to Oliver for joining us here tonight, to Maggie and Willemijn and Jesse at NUF New York, who are just incredibly supportive, not just in IT, but also helping us figure out the marketing piece of this. Of course, to our fellow board members of NUF Boston, we so look forward to hosting more events in the future. And of course, Dr. Golahny, and most certainly also your husband for that wonderful poem and cameo appearance. Thank you so very much for your time, for sharing your knowledge with us. This has been an incredible presentation, and I myself am incredibly excited to go to the MFA now and take a look at this print now that I know so much more about it. Thank you so very much. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to still pose them, or else I will bid you all a very good night. Thank you.
I would like to thank the audience, Ro, Jennifer, and Maggie, and the NAF of Boston and New York for putting this together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. With this, thank you, Dr. Golahny, and your husband. That was a beautiful poem. And thank you for the great presentation today, for sure. I got to look this back, and there's a lot to digest there, but it was wonderful. Thank you. And also, our colleagues from the Central NAF Organization, New York, thank you so much for facilitating our inaugural webinar here today. I always make sure I mention that it's a truly special time to get involved in the NAF, wherever you may be. And please join us in April for our King's Day celebration hosted by Enno Borrells here in Boston, as well as the Consulate General pop-up on May 5th. That's hosted by the Consulate General of New York for all your passport renewals. So with that, thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.